Workers were told the tunnel was sealed for safety reasons. No inspection report ever said what kind of safety, or safety from what. Have you ever been told, don't ask, and just left it alone? And for everyone watching tonight, what kind of mysteries pull you in most? Hidden places, missing records, or unexplained warnings. Stick around, because this is a story about all three at once. This is a legend passed down the way most small-town legends are, through neighbors, through old-timers who worked the land before the rest of us got there, through the kind of story that changes slightly every time it's told, but never quite loses its shape. It is not a claim about a real documented event. It's the kind of tale that survives precisely because no one can fully confirm or deny it. And that uncertainty is where this story lives, generation after generation, retelling after retelling. According to the legend, the tunnel had been part of the town's infrastructure for longer than anyone still living could remember. It ran beneath a stretch of land that had been repurposed more than once over the days, first for one kind of industry, then another, then eventually abandoned altogether as the town's economy shifted and the reasons for the tunnel's existence faded into irrelevance. For a while, it simply sat there, unused, unremarkable, one more piece of forgotten infrastructure in a town full of them. Then, the story goes, it was sealed, not abandoned, not fenced off with a warning sign and left to nature. Sealed, deliberately, thoroughly, with a wall of poured concrete built directly across the entrance, thick enough that no casual attempt to reopen it would ever succeed. That distinction matters in the way the legend is told. Abandonment is neglect. Sealing is a decision. Someone chose to make sure that tunnel could not be easily entered again, and whoever made that decision left no explanation behind for the people who came after them. The official reasoning, as it's been passed down, was simple: safety, structural instability, the kind of vague, technically plausible explanation that satisfies a town council and quietly ends the conversation. And for a while, it did exactly that. No one pushed back. No one demanded a full engineering report. The tunnel got sealed, the paperwork got filed, and the town moved on. Except, according to the legend, no one could ever actually produce that paperwork. Longtime residents were all requesting records over the years. Curious historians, local journalists working on town history pieces, even a few contractors who wanted to know what they might be dealing with if future construction ever required digging near that stretch of land. Each time, the story goes, the requests hit the same wall. No formal inspection report existed. No structural engineer's name was attached to the decision. No date, no signature, no clear chain of responsibility connecting the sealing of the tunnel to any specific safety concern that could actually be verified. That's the detail that turned a boring piece of municipal history into a story people still tell decades later. Not the sealing itself. Towns seal off old infrastructure all the time for entirely mundane reasons. It's the absence of a paper trail. It's the fact that safety reason became the explanation everyone repeated, without a single person ever being able to say safety from what exactly. The legend grew slowly, the way most good ones do. It wasn't built on one dramatic event. It was built on decades of small, accumulated oddities, the kind of details that don't mean much individually, but start to form a pattern when you line them all up. Workers who mentioned they didn't like the way the air felt near that section of them long before the sealing ever. A construction crew hired years before to do unrelated work nearby, who reportedly finished the job faster than expected and left without collecting their final tools. A handful of older residents who, when asked directly what they remembered about the tunnel, tended to change the subject rather than answer. None of that constitutes evidence in any formal sense. People forget tools. Crews finish jobs quickly for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with anything sinister. Older residents change the subject about all sorts of things, sometimes simply because the memory isn't interesting enough to revisit. But legends aren't built on formal evidence. They're built on the accumulation of small, unresolved detail that never quite add up to nothing, no matter how many times someone tries to explain them away individually. There's another piece of the legend worth mentioning, one that rarely makes it into the shorter retellings, but shows up consistently in the versions passed down by the town's older families. Before the sealing, before the tunnel became something people quietly avoided mentioning, it had apparently served a series of unremarkable practical purposes. Storage during one era, a utility access point during another, nothing that would ever draw attention on its own. What changed, according to this version of the story, wasn't the tunnel itself. It was a period of several months, sometime before the wall went up, during which access to the tunnel was restricted in stages rather than all at once. First, a padlocked gate, then a formal notice limiting entry to authorized personnel only, then finally the concrete. That gradual tightening is part of what makes the legend feel less like a single decision and more like a slow, deliberate process, as if whoever was responsible spent months working up to the final ceiling, rather than react suddenly to one specific incident. Legends built around a single dramatic event tend to fade the way ghost stories do, told once and then forgotten. Legends built around a slow, methodical process, one that looks, in hindsight, like someone carefully managing a situation rather than panicking in response to it, tend to stick around longer because they leave room for endless speculation about what exactly was being managed and why it took months instead of days. It's also worth noting how the town's relationship with the story shifted over time. In the earliest years after the sealing, the legend says, almost no one talked about the tunnel at all. It wasn't feared so much as simply forgotten, filed away as one more piece of dull municipal history. It was only a generation or two later, once the people who remembered the original sealing had started passing away and taking their first-hand knowledge with them, that the story began to take on the shape most people recognize today. Less a memory, more a mystery, reconstructed secondhand by people who never actually saw the tunnel sealed and were left to fill in the gaps themselves. That's often how the most persistent legends are built, not by the generation that witnessed the event, who usually have mundane, half-remembered explanation for most of it, but by the generation that only inherited the silence and had nothing to work with except the absence of an answer. For decades, that was where the story sat. A sealed tunnel, a missing paper trail, a handful of townspeople who preferred not to discuss it. No resolution, no confirmation, just a piece of local folklore that got passed down at kitchen tables and bar counters, told slightly differently by everyone who told it, but always circling back to the same central mystery. What exactly had someone decided needed to be sealed away? And why had they gone to such lengths to make sure no official record explained the decision? Then, according to the legend, that changed. The story goes that decades after the original sealing, a new generation of townspeople, driven by curiosity, by boredom, by the kind of restlessness that makes people finally investigate the thing everyone always told them to leave alone, decided to find out for themselves. They didn't have official permission. They didn't have a construction permit or a town council resolution. What they had was time, some basic tools, and a story that had been nagging at them for years. Breaking through decades-old poured concrete isn't a quick job, even in legend. The story describes it as taking place over multiple attempts, spread across several nights, the group working carefully to avoid drawing attention while slowly chipping away at a barrier that had been specifically built to withstand exactly this kind of effort. That detail alone says something about how seriously whoever sealed the tunnel had taken the job. This wasn't a quick patch job meant to discourage casual trespass. It was built to last, built to hold, built by someone who apparently wanted to make absolutely certain that whatever was on the other side stayed there. When they finally broke through, the legend says the group expected one of two things: either an empty, unremarkable tunnel that would explain nothing and end the mystery with a shrug, or some kind of structural collapse that would confirm the boring official explanation everyone had been given for decades. What they found instead, according to the story, was neither. The tunnel wasn't empty, and it wasn't collapsed. It was, by every account, passed down through the legend, exactly as intact as it had been the day it was sealed. Walls solid, structure sound, no sign whatsoever of the instability that had supposedly justified closing it off in the first place. If the official explanation had ever been true, the tunnel itself apparently didn't agree. But it wasn't the structural condition of the tunnel that made the group stop and reconsider everything they thought they understood about the story. It was what they found deeper inside, details the legend describes only in fragments, depending on who's telling it. Some versions mention markings on the walls that didn't match any construction record from the tunnel's original use. Other versions describe objects left behind, deliberately placed rather than simply abandoned, arranged in a way that felt less like debris and more like evidence of intention. A few versions of the story go further still, describing a section of the tunnel that seemed to have been sealed a second time from the inside long after the original construction, as if whoever built the outer wall wasn't the only person who had once decided something in that tunnel needed to stay hidden. Whichever version you hear, they all end the same way. The group who broke through didn't finish exploring. According to the legend, they left before completing a full search of the tunnel's interior, and none of them have ever fully explained why. Not because they couldn't, because in every retelling, they simply won't. What makes this part of the story different from a typical retreat in fear ending is how deliberate it apparently was. This wasn't a group who panicked and bolted at the first strange noise. By most accounts, the group spent a considerable amount of time inside before deciding to leave, long enough to document some of what they found, long enough to discuss it among themselves, long enough that whatever decision they eventually made to stop and walk back out clearly wasn't made in a moment of pure panic. It was, if the legend is to be believed, a choice made with at least some degree of clarity, which is precisely what makes their continued silence afterwards so unsettling to the people who've heard the story since. There's a detail some versions of the legend include that's worth sitting with for a moment. Of the small group who went in that final time, not everyone who entered is said to have come back out the same. Not missing. Every version agrees on that much. No one vanished, no one was lost, but changed in some smaller, harder to define way, quieter afterward. Less willing to discuss the tunnel, and in some tellings, less willing to discuss much of anything related to that stretch of land at all. It's the kind of detail that could mean everything or nothing. People react to unsettling experiences in all sorts of ways that have nothing to do with the supernatural. Fear alone can make someone go quiet for years. But in the context of a story already built entirely around silence, The missing paperwork, the townspeople who wouldn't answer questions, the crew who left their tools behind. One more instance of people simply refusing to talk fits the pattern a little too neatly to ignore. That refusal is what elevated this from a solved mystery back into an even bigger one. A story that had spent decades defined by a missing paper trail and a sealed door suddenly became a story defined by people who had finally seen inside and decided some things were better left undescribed. It's worth pausing here to weigh the different ways this story could actually make sense, because a legend like this survives precisely by refusing to settle on just one. There's the structural explanation, the one closest to what the town originally claimed, even if the paperwork never backed it up. Old infrastructure sometimes really does become unstable in ways that aren't immediately obvious to anyone without specialized training to spot the warning sign. It's possible the original sealing genuinely was about safety, and the missing documentation is simply a case of decades-old municipal record keeping, falling through the cracks the way old records often do, with no larger conspiracy behind it at all. There's the historical explanation, the one that treats the tunnel not as something sinister, but as something whose original purpose simply outlived the people who remembered it. Old industrial or utility tunnels get repurposed, abandoned, and forgotten constantly. Their original function fading from institutional memory long before the physical structure itself ever does. It's entirely possible whatever the group found inside had a mundane origin that simply looked stranger, with decades of dust, decay, and half-remembered rumor layered on top of it. And there's the explanation the legend keeps circling back to, the one that never fully lets go, no matter how many boring alternatives get offered first. That the tunnel wasn't sealed to protect the town from a structural hazard at all. That it was sealed to protect the town from something else entirely, something someone decided was safer, left undocumented, unexplained, and unexplored. None of these explanations are confirmed, and the legend, true to form, refuses to pick a side. That refusal is exactly why the story is still being told. There's a fourth possibility, too, one that gets mentioned less often than the other three, but tends to linger the longest with people who hear the full story. It's the idea that the truth doesn't actually matter as much as the town's decades-long reaction to it. Whatever was or wasn't in that tunnel, an entire community organized itself around not discussing it, sealing it, then resealing it, then passing down a culture of silence sturdy enough to survive multiple generations without a single formal explanation ever being written down. That kind of collective, sustained avoidance is rare. Most secrets leak eventually. Most silences crack under the weight of curious grandchildren, ambitious journalists, or simple carelessness. This one, according to the legend, never did. And if a town can maintain that level of quiet for this long, entirely without official coordination, entirely without anyone ever formally agreeing to keep the secret, it raises a question that might be more unsettling than anything actually found inside the tunnel. What does it take to make an entire community decide, independently and repeatedly, across generation, that some things really are better left sealed? That question doesn't have an answer in the legend, and it probably never will. But it's the one that tends to stay with people longest after the story ends. Not curiosity about what was inside the tunnel, but quieter unease about how easily silence can be inherited, passed down like a family trait, absorbed by people who never even asked where it came from in the first place. To this day, according to those who tell it, the tunnel sits resealed, not with the same industrial concrete as before, but closed off again all the same, this time by the very people who broke through it in the first place. No official report exists describing what they found. No photographs have ever circulated widely enough to settle the question one way or another. And the handful of people said to have been part of that group have, by every account, simply gone quiet about it, the same way the older residents did decades before them. Maybe that's the most fitting way a story like this can end. Not with an answer, but with the same silence it started with, passed down once again to whoever hears it next. It's worth sitting with how strange that is when you really think about it. Most stories that survive for generations do so because someone eventually gets the answer. A confession, a discovery, a document that finally surfaces after everyone assumed it never would. This one hasn't followed that pattern. It has had every opportunity to resolve itself. The wall came down, people went inside, and still, somehow, the silence held. That's rarer than the mystery itself, and it might be the real reason this story has outlasted so many others like. So we'll leave it with you the same way this story has been left with everyone who's heard it before. If you finally broke through a door you'd been warned about your entire life, and what you found made things worse instead of better, would you tell anyone what you saw? Or would you seal it back up and let the next generation wonder the same way you once did, the way every generation before you apparently chose to?